I love that joke. I do it all the time. So before we get underway, I wanted to talk about a couple of things, which I often do. First off, what we did last time on Tuesday was sort of all of what I wanted to cover with the skin, and that was recorded, and there's a YouTube video for that. I'm going to put together the online presentation stuff for that, which won't be a whole lot more than what I went over. I will have a section where I'll talk about hair and nails in more detail, but I think I hit all of the important parts there. With the 3-day weekend coming up, I hope to get caught up on that stuff. So I should have everything up by Monday. In the interim, for the folders that say online content, and I'm doing this because I'm doing it for my other classes, I went ahead and put the video of what we did last Tuesday. So if you need to go back and look at that stuff, there's a link to it right there. When I put the presentation stuff together, which will basically be what I did in class with a few extra things, I'll take this out and put those things in there. But in the meantime, until I have that ready, I just put the video of Tuesday's class there. I'm also recording today, and I'll record next week's. Well, okay. Yeah, I am recording next week's, but today's video that will eventually be about the skeletal system, I'll put in this folder here, which is currently empty. Before we get to the second class that we'll be dealing with the skeleton with you guys, I'll have hopefully the online content ready to go. So I won't put the videos in that folder after I've gotten them, the stuff that I want to. But in the meantime, that's the way it's going to work. I already did that for the skin. I'll do that for the skeleton stuff until I get the skeleton stuff up there. So the other thing I wanted to ask about has to do with registration, or with, yeah, registration. The school, has a priority registration period where current students can sign up for classes for the next semester. And then once everybody that has that priority access to it, it's open then to other students that are new to the school. And the reason I'm curious is because as a department, we're sort of in the midst of getting everything ready for that. And I am the sort of person that puts the schedule together for our department right now. And I was talking with the dean, who of course is in charge of this ultimately, but I'm doing the grunt work for it, of course. And this semester has just been very under-enrolled across the board. It's like you guys here today, the Tuesday, Thursday lecture is supposed to be split up into 2 labs, one that meets on Monday and one that meets on Wednesday. And originally it was like that in the list of classes, but both labs were fairly under-enrolled. Okay, there's 16 seats in each lab, which would mean there should be 32 people in this class, but obviously there's not. And I think there were 4 or 5 people actually signed up for the Wednesday lab and 7 or 8, whatever, for the Monday lab. So the dean cut the Wednesday lab, and the people that had signed up for the Wednesday lab were encouraged to just change and be in the Monday lab. Some of you that happened to, some other people who aren't in the class either couldn't make that switch or decided after all that they didn't want to take the class. I don't know. I try not to take it personally. But so that's why we have a very small class and only 1 lab meeting for it. And then all my other classes are sort of the same way, except for my night classes. Night classes usually fill pretty well, but my day classes are kind of under-enrolled. And so I was talking with the dean about this stuff, and one of the things he mentioned is sort of something special to my classes. And I want to just survey all of my students to get some feedback from them. So first off, and we'll just do this with a show of hands if you wouldn't mind. When you were signing up for this class back last semester or whenever you signed up for it, did you go to the this page on the website that lists all the classes to decide which classes you want to take and look at that stuff? Did everybody do that? How did you pick this class? So within WebAdvisor, you just had it search for stuff? Okay. I'm not sure what it looks like in that. Okay, but what I'm about to actually ask about might apply to if you did it within WebAdvisor. I'm actually not sure. And what I'm asking now is there's the comments field over here. Which for most of the classes is just saying if you're signing up for this lecture, you have to sign up for that lab, or if you're signing up for that lab, you have to sign up, that sort of thing. And some of them say, web-assisted course, which means it's a regular course that uses Blackboard. And then for me, I have a bit more, which says, well, so this is not this particular class, but it says, you have to register for the lab section that goes with it. It's a hybrid course. And then please visit the faculty webpage for more information. Now, one slightly unfortunate thing about this right now is that this was an active link. So where it says faculty webpage, you could click on that. And the webmaster pulled the links because I updated the course numbers in my links, and so that link broke. And he was too lazy to just fix it, so he just took the whole link out. So when you hopefully went in here, there was a link there. And I don't know if it actually works this way, but hopefully just in the WebAdvisor search function, it should give you the comments field for the courses too. And if not, then I got to talk to somebody about that. But so my ultimate question is, did anybody actually click on that link to go to the page that's talking about? Okay. Sorry?
I don't remember. That was for everyone else.
Okay. For those of you that just used WebAdvisor to do this, did you even see any kind of link that you know of?
Yeah, there was a link.
There was a link. You just didn't click on it. Okay. Why?
I knew what I was getting myself into, and I knew what professor I wanted. So.
Well, I'm flattered. You were not at all curious about?
I had friends that had already taken the class, so they filled me in.
Okay.
And I have to take it anyways for my program.
Okay. Anybody else that was using the WebAdvisor system that you saw the link and didn't bother clicking on it, and you have a reason why?
No, I just pure lazy. I did like my schedule.
So you really kind of picked it because it fit best with your schedule.
Exactly.
And you didn't really care what you're getting yourself into. It's the only one that worked for you.
No, I heard you were a really good professor, so I was like, perfect. I'm going.
All right. Okay, I appreciate that, but yeah, you have an excuse for not clicking on that link. So if you had clicked on that link, it would have taken you to this page. In the discussion I was having with my dean, he feels that this is not the most helpful page in the world. And this is kind of a theme across campus for a lot of informational sources that we have, which is those of us that write pages like this aren't thinking about what the person reading it really needs to know. So, and truthfully, all I did is I said, I got to make a page real quick. So I typed up in like 5 minutes a little synopsis of what I thought was useful. Sorry?
I went to this through your, if I click on you through.
Oh, okay. So you got to the back.
Professor Brinkman told me to
okay.
look at it. So.
Well, that's what the link would have been. So that's a good excuse for not clicking on a link because you went there a different way. But yeah, since that link doesn't actually work on the page that I was just showing you, I went the way you did, which was go to my faculty webpage.
Yeah.
There. But so what I was hoping to get some feedback on, and not right now, I don't want to take up today's class to talk about it, but if people would be so willing as to look at these pages and give me feedback on, as a student, if this would have been helpful to you, what you might have been looking for in an explanation of a class, or now that you're in the class, things that you think that this should say to be
I think
more.
all professors should have this,
Yeah, that would be.
under the faculty.
Yeah, it's hard to make all professors do anything, because there are a lot of people like, I've been doing it this way for years, I'm not gonna change. But anyways, yeah, it would be nice if there was something like that. But I would appreciate it if anybody could look at this, especially with the gift of hindsight now we've gotten in the class, if this is a fair description of what it is, if this represents the kind of information that students actually want when they're trying to make a decision about classes, that sort of thing. And, sorry? I would be motivated to reward you for efforts if you gave me useful information back, yes. There is a column in the grade book that's extra credit, and I can put whatever I want in there, so.
I like this. That's my opinion, because I already looked at it.
Okay. So if you are interested in looking at this and giving me some feedback, you can get to this by going into, well, definitely go under My Instructor, which this information's in the syllabus section too. But I have a link here to, it says personal link, and you can see that it says sites.google.com/site/POA&P, and that's just my faculty webpage. Or if you want to, you can go to stick.edu, meet our faculty, and there's a link to this page as my faculty webpage. And if you click on this, you get to this page, which is terribly unhelpful these days. I really need to change it. But there's two links, AMP1 and AMP2. And obviously you're in AMP1, but I think they say actually the exact same thing. And actually for you guys specifically, most of my classes are taught in a hybrid fashion, so that blurb is more about that. It does say I do have a traditional lecture version, but again, if you could look at it with the eye of a student planning on taking courses and tell me how useful that page is, I'd appreciate it. So, just wanted to open that up and get people helping out with that if you could. So, because the dean would really appreciate that. Now, I did for you guys give sort of a full explanation of the practical exam, right? I think I did it for you guys, and I told all my other classes to go watch that recording. I might have done it, well, because my other classes I don't have as much time, so I didn't want to spend 20 minutes or whatever it was that I took to do it. I can't remember now if I did it the day that we looked at the cystic fibrosis case or the day that we did microscopes in lab, one of the two. But
And you did it for both.
The case.
okay, so if you are not remembering that, you can go back to the recording on the cystic fibrosis case and it explains it. But I just want to be sure, because you do have the practical coming up, that if I want to be sure I've explained that to everybody. And speaking of that, just remember next week's, well, I shouldn't say next week. The next unit or week folder is for the practical, which is on the 19th, not next week. But you are responsible for being familiar with the cases that are in there. We went through the cystic fibrosis case in some detail, but the other ones, the terminology, symptom, and system breakdown, that information, I expect everybody to have one. The outline there, it's an old outline, and I don't really like outlines as it is. But the first 2 pages are kind of a quick overview of the terms we use for direction of the body and body cavities and the microscope and the types of tissue. And then the other 5 pages is just every single bone that you're responsible for knowing laid out in with something to say about each of them, because I don't have time to go through and talk about every single bone in the lab period that we have for that. So I put it into the outline. That's what this outline is useful for. Okay. So in preparing for things, be sure that you're familiar with the case and you have the outline sort of as an overview of things. In lab next week, which will be on Tuesday, remember, we're going to be doing the skeleton, and I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about how to study for the test, because studying bones and the skeleton fits into a different, thinking about what you're actually going to be tested on as far as the cases are concerned. It won't make any sense to talk about it right now, so when we talk about the skeleton next week, I'll say something about that for you. But okay. So we will get to actual content today now. And I'm going to go to the presentation on the bones and skeleton. Now, actually, just to be sure, on Tuesday, I showed you all the chapters, and I said there's actually 3 skeleton chapters, right? Okay. So the content that we're covering here is about just that first chapter, which is the bone tissue and something. I can't remember the full. Maybe it's bone tissue and overview of the skeleton or something like that. That chapter. The other 2 chapters that are the axial skeleton, the appendicular skeleton, that's the lab material that we'll be working with next week. So this is just about that chapter, and it basically does 2 things, maybe 3. And that's what we're going to do today and next Thursday in lecture. I'm going to cover this material from the presentation for you there. Again, I will have the presentation material online also, hopefully after this weekend. But for you guys having the traditional lecture course, we will actually do sort of traditional lecture stuff on this. So it'll start by introducing what bones are, the idea of them as organs, what tissues actually make up bones besides just bone tissue. And then, and the cells that are specific to bone tissue. And then we'll look at how bones grow, sort of starting with how bones originally grow, how the fetal skeleton develops. And then thinking about what happens as bones grow after birth, how a toddler ends up being full-sized, and other changes that take place after birth. And then also looking at how bones repair themselves when they're broken, which is really just a growth process also. So that's what we're going to be doing today and next Thursday to cover this chapter. So I like to, as I'm introducing chapter material, I like to start off with a list of what the major functions of the organ system is. Now, I did that with the skin, but that's because I was really making a point about how the functions and the tissues interact. But I think it's a good way to start off every organ system. Just this is the big picture of what the organ system is about. And I will try to kind of refer back to this when we're talking about certain things, but also this hopefully is a sort of a framework for you to put the information into as you're learning it. So the bones or the skeleton, and some of these functions are just at the organ level, meaning the bone level, and some of them are at the system level, meaning the skeleton level. And some of them can be looked at in both ways. So there's support. Obviously, our skeleton supports our whole body, but we can also talk about specific bones supporting specific parts of our body. It's protective. The most obvious example of that would be the rib cage, which surrounds the heart and the lungs. But really, the skeleton, being a rigid structure, provides protection in a lot of other ways. Okay? You have a thigh bone, it's in the middle of your thigh, so it's not covering any of the soft tissue, but by providing that support, it's also protecting your leg from crumpling and getting damaged. I've put movement in here, which kind of goes with the book's unit title, which is about support and movement and that sort of thing. The bones don't produce movement. That's what the muscles do that we're going to get to after the practical. But they are bones, the skeleton is the basis of movement. We make movements based on how the bones fit together. After the practical, we're actually going to go into looking at the joints. There's a chapter on joints specifically, and then the muscles. And so in the joints chapter, that's kind of looking at the movement aspect of the skeleton, how the bones are arranged together, and how they allow for different types of movement. And then the last two here, really more just organ level aspects of what bones do. Bones are a site of mineral storage, primarily calcium. And we'll talk about the homeostatic mechanism of regulating calcium levels in the body, because it actually fits into some of the growth processes that we're talking about. And then also bones are the site of blood cell formation. Now, mineral storage is obviously calcium in the bone matrix. Blood cell formation is actually because of another tissue that's in the bone called the red bone marrow. So it's not about the bone tissue doing anything, but the bone as an organ contains a tissue that makes the blood cells, and that's the red bone marrow. So we actually won't talk about the blood cell formation too much at all, other than I'll point out where the red bone marrow is. But really the function of making blood cells, that's something that we're going to deal with when we get to the blood chapter in A&P2. And we'll come back to thinking about, that's taking place in the bones. Oh, I have not updated the pictures in this presentation. So a lot of these pictures are out of an old textbook. I didn't even think about that before I pulled it up, but I will get all of these replaced over the weekend, so we'll have pictures out of the book. But the conceptual information from these pictures is exactly like what the book has. It's just the particular drawings and whatnot that are used are different. This concept isn't terribly important. Okay, I'd be fine to just skip over it, except that it's helpful to know about this in terms of some other things we're going to talk about. So we can classify bones based on their basic shapes. And I would not go through this list in the order that this particular figure shows it. So I'm going to go through it in my order, which is I want to start with long bones. Now, I want to start with long bones because that's going to be our go-to example of a bone. In kind of every organ system, we have sort of a representative example of something that we're talking about. And for the skeleton, it's a long bone. This is the humerus, which is your upper arm bone. We'll also have pictures of the femur, which is the upper leg bone. And they're just good representatives of what's going on. And by learning about things that have to do with the long bones, that will cover things that have to do with all the other types of bones for the most part. So it's a good place to start to cover all of our bases. And then we just, after that, say, and it's like this for the other types of bones. What defines long bones isn't necessarily that they're long or that they have a certain length. It's like things are long bones as long as they're longer than 10 centimeters or something like that. That's not the way it works. It's strictly based on their shape. They have a shaft that is made up of primarily compact bone. It's hollow in the center. And then on either end, they have an enlargement, which we call a head. Okay? And there are two heads. So this thing that really looks like a head is a head. But then this thing down here is also referred to as a head. And we're going to look at the structure of long bones in more detail. And we'll look at the Greek names of the mean head and shaft here. Long bones can actually be pretty darn short. Each bone in one segment of a finger or a toe is a long bone because it has a shaft with a head on either end. Now they're very, very short. And if you think about your pinky toe, there are long bones that are probably that long. Okay? But they still fit into that classification because of their shape. Then the next bone to talk about is called a short bone. And it would seem that long bones and short bones would sound like they're opposites of each other. It's just the way that they're named. Really what a short bone is a more like a cube-shaped bone. Now they can have rather different shapes than that. But the idea, if you think about a cube, it has flat faces on it. Okay? And the way that short bones interact with each other, they have those flat faces moving across each other in a two-dimensional plane, rather than the typical type of joint like we'd see at the shoulder or the elbow, where we have movement like a hinge or something like that. So short bones are called short bones sort of as an opposite word to long bone, but they really are cube sort of shaped bones with flat faces that interact with other bones in a two-dimensional plane. There are short bones that are longer than some long bones, or short bones that are bigger than some long bones. The primary place where we see short bones is in the wrist and the ankle. So there's 7 bones in your wrist, right around here at the base of your palm. And there are 7 bones in your ankle. There's an ankle bone that's maybe half the size of this computer mouse, okay? And that would be classified as a short bone, but it's huge compared to the little long bone that's in your pinky toe, okay? So again, long and short isn't really about their size or their relative size, but rather about their individual shapes. Then the next one to mention is a flat bone, which is obviously flat. But flat has a variety of meanings. So I like to describe it as flat, not flat like a pancake, but flat like Kansas. Can anybody tell me what that saying means? Pancakes don't have hills on them. Well, what's the difference between the flatness of a pancake and the flatness of Kansas?
Nobody likes Kansas.
That doesn't have to do with its flatness compared to the flatness of a pancake. It has to do with, it doesn't go good with syrup or something like that. Nobody wants to try this one? So actually, that saying is a little silly, because if we had a pancake the same size as Kansas, then it would be flat like Kansas. Okay. It's a matter of scale. If you're standing on one part of Kansas and you're looking out, you see to the horizon. What shape is the horizon? Around here, the horizon's not too easy to read because we have hills and that sort of thing. But when you have very flat land, the horizon off in the distance has actually got a very particular shape.
Straight line. Straight line.
Not a straight line. It's got a curve because it's the surface of the earth. Okay. And that's the point, is Kansas is, we call it flat, but it really has a bit of curve because it's a segment of the crust of the earth, and that's the globe. And flat bones in our body are curved also. So the example bone they have here is one of the bones of the skull called the parietal bone, and you can kind of see that there's a curve there. A very extreme example of a flat bone with a curve would be a rib. Okay. When you cut a flat bone in cross-section, you see spongy bone filling up most of the inner space with a thin layer of compact bone as a shell on the outside, which actually we see in short bones and certain parts of long bones also. But that's what you see in cross-section. And then it'll curve with that cross-section going all throughout it. If you cut through a rib in cross-section, you're going to see that same kind of profile. But the rib obviously curves almost 180 degrees around. So flat bones are actually very curved. It's just if you look at them in profile, they have a very flat profile. I should define that word, profile. If you hear profile, you probably think of a silhouette, somebody's face like that. Okay, that's the common word for profile. Profile actually means a two-dimensional shape of a three-dimensional object. So if you were to shine light across my face, the shadow over here is my profile. Okay? But if you were to shine light on me and I'm facing this direction, you get a different shape, but that's still technically my profile. Okay? So the silhouette profile with the nose sticking out like that is our common understanding what profile means. But really, profile just means the two-dimensional shape of a three-dimensional object. So if we cut through something, not just a bone, a tissue of any sort, what we see under the microscope, that two-dimensional shape, that's the profile of the three-dimensional thing. So flat bones have a flat profile, but the bone itself is actually you'd see that it does have a bit of a curve to it, but being very short and not terribly wide, you don't see the curve in it too much because of its overall size, but it does have a bit of a curve to it. So those are flat bones. So I would start by just defining the long bone, the short bone, and the flat bone. And then I get to the irregular bones, which is really what we call anything that doesn't fit into one of those three categories. Okay? They can have characteristics of any of those three. The picture here shows us a vertebral bone, and the top and the bottom of the body, the big round part here, is a flat surface that makes contact with the flat surface of the next one, which is a lot like a short bone. The spinous process that sticks out here, which is why we call the vertebral column spine, is based on calling that a spinous process. If we were to cut through that, it would have a flat profile. Okay? If it were bigger, we'd see a bit of a curve to it. Well, it doesn't really have any long bone characteristics to it, but it doesn't easily get classified in any of these kinds of specific shapes, irregular. So anything that doesn't fit into one of those three is technically just irregular. It's a catch-all for everything else. Now, this figure introduces two other types of bones, and it's fair to do this to some extent, but they're really unusual situations. Okay? A sesamoid bone, and the example we have here is the kneecap, is different because of how it develops. All of the other bones in your body develop in one of two ways, which we're going to be talking about later on, except for sesamoid bones. Okay? The other bones of your body either develop from a cartilage intermediary, the fetal skeleton starts off as cartilage and then it calcifies, or it starts off from the embryonic tissue called mesenchyme and develops directly into bone. Sesamoid bones are different because they develop out of other soft tissues. The patella, the kneecap, is just a calcified part of the tendon that connects the muscle in your thigh to your shin bone, your tibia. And everybody has that kind of sesamoid bone. Other sesamoid bones are quirks of development. Okay, there are some people that have sesamoid bones in, I think it's right here by the base of the pinky. Some people have an extra bone there because a tendon that goes across there, based on how people hold their hands to write or use their hands, just calcifies there. Not everybody has that. It's actually a fairly rare occurrence. That would be considered a sesamoid bone. I think actually one of the wrist bones might develop as a sesamoid bone also rather than other types, but that's all it means. It gets its name because, especially for the patella, it's shaped like a sesame seed. But what's important is that it develops out of other soft tissues differently from any other bone. And then the other type, which a lot of sources won't even bother putting in this classification scheme, is a sutural bone. The suture is the joint between, or the seam between, two bones in the cranium. Sutural bones are when an extra bone just develops within that space. So usually what happens is we have a bone starting to form here, and it grows out in all directions. And a bone starting here, and it grows out in all directions. And then where they come up against each other, that's where the suture forms. Okay. Sutural bones form because another little piece of bone forms in where the suture would be, and so there's a little bone that developed right there and grew in for the suture. Okay. It is also a fairly rare way for bones to develop. It's developing the same way that the other bones of the skull do. It's just doing it in a unique position. And a lot of people won't have that. But and they don't make any big difference to how the skull works. They're only interesting if you're looking at a skull post-mortem and you can see it there. It doesn't have any functional effect on what the skull does. But they are different in that not everybody has them, and when you're learning about the bones of the skull, you'll come across these little bones. They don't have a name. They're just sutural bones because they crop up sort of accidentally, I guess you'd say. So, now, again, this classification of bones I don't think is terribly important, except that we're going to be talking about bones, and we want to think about long versus short versus flat type stuff. So it's important to have heard of this stuff. It'll fit in with what we're talking about. And we're actually going to start by talking about, and again, these are pictures out of a different book. I'll update them with the pictures of our book, but they show basically the same thing. We're going to start by looking at what it means for an organ to be called a bone. Okay, so like I was saying with the skin, we got to think about the different types of tissue and how they come together to make up an organ. And bones are organs. They have in them bone tissue, but they have other tissues in them also. So the example that we use to describe the structure of a bone, for the most part, is a long bone, and this happens to be the femur. So what I'm about to describe only applies to the structure of long bones, and then I'll tell you what about that applies to the structure of other bones. So I described long bones as having a shaft and then a head at either end. That shaft is called the diaphysis. It has a thick, compact bone wall, and then it's hollow through the center, what's called the medullary cavity. Medulla means middle. Hopefully you can see how those two words are very similar. So medullary cavity just means the hole down in the middle of the shaft. The medullary cavity is filled with bone marrow. In adults, the bone marrow in the medullary cavity is yellow bone marrow, which means that it's adipose tissue. I think during development, and by that I don't really know if I mean fetal or postnatal development, it's red bone marrow. But as people age, a lot of red bone marrow stops being functional and this just becomes adipose tissue, which is yellow bone marrow. So that's what fills the medullary cavity. The wall is a thick, compact bone wall. And it provides a lot of strength for the pressure that's going to be put on the bone as you're standing on your legs. The shape of a bone, a circular shaft with a hollow center, is actually architecturally a very sound design element, let's call it. If you look at a bridge, the pylons that hold bridges up are in fact hollow cylinders, okay? Because it distributes the weight evenly around all of the outside of the cylinder. If it was a solid cylinder, then the weight would be distributed sort of right in a particular place, which isn't necessarily the middle of the cylinder, and therefore the weight support might be off center. But when it's a hollow cylinder, the weight gets distributed evenly around the center because of the hollowness of gets distributed equally around the wall because the center is hollow. It forces the physics of the pylon to work that way. And our legs work the same way. All long bones work the same way. But you need the thick, compact bone to be strong enough to support weight in that dimension. That's what we call the diaphysis. Now the heads are what we call the epiphyses. Epiphysis is singular, epiphyses plural. There's always a proximal and a distal epiphysis. Well, I should say, for all the long bones in the arms and the legs, there's a proximal and distal epiphysis. that's where most of the long bones in our body are. So, since we're looking at the femur, the proximal epiphysis is going to be the one at the hip joint, and the distal epiphysis is going to be the one at the knee joint. We're talking about the humerus, then the proximal one will be at the shoulder, and the distal one would be at the elbow. Okay. Talking about one of the phalanges in your fingers, then the proximal one is going to be closer to your hand, and the distal one will be closer to your fingertip. Okay. It's always going to have those two ends. For the few long bones that are located elsewhere in the body where distal proximal doesn't really make any sense for them, they usually have specific names for the two ends. Okay. But again, most of the long bones are in the arms and legs, and so distal proximal epiphyses makes sense. Now in the book, or in the picture here, and I think in the book picture we have also, there's a little space in between the diaphysis and the epiphysis on either side, which is called the metaphysis. Now, the metaphysis is a real thing, but you will see certain sources leave it out. And in fact, in this book that I'm currently infringing on copyright by showing you, and the book that we have, they start off by showing you the long bone like this, and they put in where the metaphysis is. And then I think in this book, so maybe in a picture I'll show you in a while, and definitely in the book that we're using now, a later picture of a long bone, they leave metaphysis out. They just have diaphysis and epiphysis. The metaphysis is just the transition between the two. Okay, so the compact bone wall sort of tapers off a little bit. No, I should have said that differently. The medullary cavity tapers off a little bit, so you can kind of see it coming to a point right here. The compact bone wall thins out and ends up just being the outside edge. And then the bone we do see between the tapering medullary cavity and the edge of the bone, that's all spongy bone. Okay. The epiphyses are really just spongy bone with a very thin shell of compact bone surrounding them, which is what we see in short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, sesamoid bones, and sutural bones. They're all just a spongy bone center with a thin shell of compact bone making for a smooth outside edge. The only place where we see significant compact bone in any bone is in the diaphysis of a long bone. Otherwise, it's always a very thin sheet, which is kind of represented in this picture of a flat bone off to the side. Okay. So this is a flat bone, not an epiphysis or other type of bone, but it's mostly spongy bone in the middle with just a thin shell of compact bone on the outside. Now, in this picture, they're using some somewhat old-fashioned names for these things. The outside edge of compact bone is called the cortex, and the inside, I'm not even quite sure how to pronounce that word. I think it's diploid, but I don't pronounce whatever, I mean, I don't speak whatever language that comes from. And it might be, I don't know, a Dutch word or something like that. I don't know, something, it's not Germanic. Germanic doesn't have that vowel construction there at the end, but German does have the umlauts over the occasional vowel. I just don't know what it is. And really, it's an old-fashioned name. Most people won't talk about that specifically, just refer to that as spongy bone. But that's what we see in the epiphyses. And so the metaphysis is really just where we transition from the thick compact bone wall to what's mostly spongy bone in the epiphyses. The other thing that's important about the metaphysis is that's where the bone grew longer. Okay? In an adult bone, there's really nothing distinguishing the metaphysis from the rest of it. It's all bone. But in childhood and adolescence, the metaphysis had a growth plate, which was cartilage, and that is what made the bone grow longer. Okay. So that's the basic layout of a long bone. And other bones are basically the same as the epiphysis of one of these, just spongy bone with a thin compact bone shell on the outside. Now, the majority of what makes up bones is bone tissue. So we want to also think about the cells that play a part there. And there are 4 types of cells that we're interested in. I'm going to write this up on the board real quick just to organize the names, but they're all up here. Of course, it kind of falls off the side here. So the first one I want to mention is the osteoprogenitor cell, which a lot of sources will kind of skip over because they're fairly rare in adult cells and they're hard to distinguish from the next one I'm going to tell you about. But the idea here is this is the cell that is sort of the first stem cell of bone tissue. And it gives rise to the next type of cell, which is called an osteoblast. Now, the reason why some sources won't even bother with the progenitor cell is because it's really hard to tell them apart, especially in adult tissue, from osteoblasts. They're basically the same kind of cell. But there is definitely a progenitor cell in the story somewhere, so we want to mention it. Osteoblasts are highlighted in this picture over here. They're responsible for making bone matrix. They secrete a protein-rich substance called osteoid, which is going to end up incorporating calcium crystals in to make the hard bone matrix. So this little blue space that we see here is what's going to become bone matrix, and then we can see the matrix that was made previously as it's sort of expanding out and making that bone grow. There's a layer of osteoblasts covering the outside of every cell and lining the inside, sorry, I said that wrong. Covering the outside of every bone and lining the inside of every bone. When it's on the inside of the bone, it's referred to as the endosteum. Okay? And what that means is it's a line of osteoblasts that covers the inside surface of the medullary cavity, which is what this picture is showing us. We would also see it on any internal spaces of spongy bone. Okay? It's just a layer of those types of cells. Okay? And there might be the occasional osteoprogenitor cell in that space, but again, it's really hard to tell them apart in adult tissue. And you are not going to be asked to identify these types of cells in microscope, so don't worry about, the cartoons here look like it's really different, but actually under the microscope you can't tell the difference. And you're not going to be asked to, so don't worry about it. The next type is called an osteocyte, which I can't quite get on the screen here, but I'll write it down over there in a second. As the osteoblasts make bone matrix, a cell has to stay behind within the matrix to help maintain it through the life of the bone. And we can see sort of the corner of an osteocyte right here. This line is representing a layer of bone matrix. What happens is the osteoblasts lay down a layer of bone matrix, and then a few of them stay behind in the matrix, become osteocytes, and maintain that matrix for the rest of its life. And then more matrix is laid down on top of those cells. So osteoblasts actually give rise to osteocytes. This kind of represents a family tree. Okay, so they're the progenitor cells that give rise to the bone tissue to begin with. Osteoblasts are really technically stem cells also, but they're very, very specific stem cells. They only make osteocytes. But they make osteocytes when they're needed for the bone matrix that they're also making. So these 3 cells are related to each other because they're all kind of the same type of cell at different stages of development. It's like grandfather, daddy, and baby osteocyte, whatever. The 4th type of cell is different from all of these. It's not part of the relationship, and that's what's called an osteoclast. Now, it's a little bit unfortunate because the word osteoclast looks very, very similar to osteoblast. There's just one letter difference between the two. But there's a world of difference between what the cells do. So osteoblasts make bone matrix. Okay? Osteoclasts take it apart. And we always have this balance, and this is part of the homeostatic mechanism that regulates calcium levels in our body. That osteoblasts build bone matrix, taking calcium out of our blood. Osteoclasts break down bone matrix and release calcium back into our blood. So if our blood calcium levels are high, osteoblasts put it in the bone. If our blood calcium levels are low, osteoclasts release calcium from the bone back into the blood. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about that mechanism next lecture when we get to that part of this material. Now, from this picture, what can you tell me that's obviously very different about osteoclasts compared to the other cells here? Or compared to any other cell?
They have multiple nucleus.
Right, these are all individual nuclei within a single cell. How many nuclei should a cell have? One. Can anybody tell me what it means when you see a cell with multiple nuclei? It's only one way that happens. Anybody know? It's because individual cells merge together. Okay? So it's sort of like if you move in with your boyfriend and you bring your television and he has his television, you got two televisions in the house, but only one house. Whatever. Okay. Same idea. That's a weird example, but go with it. So we can look at this, and there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 22, is that right? I think. 22 nuclei are represented in that picture, suggesting that 22 individual cells all merge together to make this big osteoblast. Now, as I understand it, which is a way of me saying I might not be right about this, but as I understand it, osteoclasts are actually derived from white blood cells. Okay? And the reason why that's important is because what osteoclasts do is they have extensions of their cell membrane that kind of reach out and break down the bone matrix and pull it apart. White blood cells kind of do that too when they're gobbling up bacteria or cellular debris in your body or whatever. Okay? So they work on similar principles, but osteoclasts are not white blood cells. They might be derived from white blood cells, but they're very different cells once they're part of bone tissue. They are, however, separate from the other three types. Okay? So the other three types, osteoprogenitors, osteoblasts, and osteocytes, are related cells. Okay? One gives rise to the next, which gives rise to the next. Osteoclasts come from somewhere very different, and they work actually kind of against the osteoblasts to keep bone matrix and calcium homeostasis in balance. Okay. Those are the major cells that we're going to be considering in the bone tissue. This picture is kind of showing some of these cells in relation to the whole bone again, and I mentioned this a little bit. Lining the inside spaces of, whether it's the medullary cavity or the inside of the spongy bone, we have the endosteum, which will probably have the occasional osteoclast in there, but all of the other cells are really osteoblasts. Okay? They do point to an osteoprogenitor cell here, but again, under the microscope, you can't tell them apart. That's on the inside surface of the bone. On the outside surface of the bone, you have what's called the periosteum. Endosteum inside, periosteum outside. Periosteum is made up of two layers. One of them is a layer of osteoblasts, which is called the cellular layer of the periosteum. And they've pulled it back with forceps here as if you could separate the tissue away. Can't really do that, but for the sake of a drawing, they did that. And there's a layer of osteoblasts on the inside, on the edge of the bone there. And then the outer covering there is called the fibrous layer of the periosteum, which is a dense, irregular connective tissue sheath covering the whole thing. If you've ever worked with butchered meat or anything like that, with a bone, before you cook it, you probably have noticed that there's a thin white film that you can kind of peel off the bone. That's the fibrous pericardium. In doing that, you're probably tearing some of the cellular layer of the periosteum off too, but with your naked eye, you can't see that.
Is that the epimysium?
We're talking about bones, not muscles. But once you cook meat, if you cook a steak on a grill or whatever, the periosteum, you can't peel that off anymore after you've cooked it because of what happens to the collagen in that tissue. Okay. Pre-cooked in the raw state, you can peel collagenous connective tissue off of a bone. Okay. Once you cook it, the collagen denatures in the heat of whatever method you're using to cook, and it gelatinizes around the bone, which is actually helps if you have ever heard anybody talk about the difference between making bone-in or bone-less chops or whatever. The presence of the periosteum actually does lend a little bit to the flavoring of the meat by gelatinization processes. I like to throw in the occasional cooking reference to things. Not that I'm encouraging cannibalism, but rather to just suggest how the tissue works. On the outside of the periosteum, you'll have major blood vessels. But what's not represented in this picture is branches off of these blood vessels go in through the periosteum to supply blood to the tissue of the bone. And then by this point in the course, we've already looked at compact bone tissue structure. So you go back to the tissue chapter in the book, which you should be doing because you're going to be completing your microscope practical by Tuesday, by Monday, right? Isn't it the 12th? That's due? Yeah. So if you haven't done it yet, you better have it because you need to know this stuff about the structure of bone tissue. And you'll be aware of osteons and lamellae. Any of that sound familiar? A lot of people have stuff to do with it. Lamella just means layer, okay? And that's layers of bone matrix. Osteocytes are in between layers of tissue. There are circumferential lamellae. Oh, actually, I bet the next picture addresses this. Yeah. Okay. So there are circumferential lamellae, meaning they go around the entire outside of the bone, the circumference of the bone. And then there are osteons, which are concentric layers of bone matrix around a hollow core where we see blood vessels. And those are called concentric lamellae. Okay. Now, anywhere that we have layers of bone matrix that aren't part of an osteon or aren't part of the circumference, those are called interstitial lamellae. And interstitial just means in between things. The compact bone tissue that makes up the wall of the diaphysis, for instance, is a continuous piece of bone tissue. So in this little triangular region here, between these two osteons and the circumferential lamellae, you need something in there. So interstitial lamellae just fills in that space. And some of them can be kind of big regions, and so they'll have layers of bone matrix there. And then when we get to the inside, the layer structure gets less and less organized, and we have a very thin coating of spongy bone on the inside. And when we talk about how these things develop, it'll make sense that there's spongy bone on the inside of the diaphysis wall. And here we can see the blood vessels on the outside with blood vessels perforating in through the tissue and connecting to the blood vessels in each osteon. Now, the blood vessels were there first. The bone calcified around the blood vessels. So this canal that it's passing through here didn't open up for the blood vessel to grow through. Rather, the blood vessel was there and the bone matrix calcified around it. So the blood vessels are kind of in the tissue and the tissue develops around it, making the hard bone matrix. What's not pointed out in this picture is that there's more than just blood vessels going through there. There's also going to be nerve and nerve fibers going through there. And there are these other types of vessels called lymphatic vessels. So anywhere that you see arteries and veins, you should expect to see nerve fibers and lymphatic vessels too. Just at this point in AMD1, they usually leave those out in pictures because we haven't talked about the nervous system and the lymphatic system.
We you find those
Where do you-
blood vessels? Is it all blood bones? Or?
Yeah, so the bone is living tissue, so it needs a blood supply. So there's going to be blood vessels all throughout it. Of course, we're looking at what would be a microscopic image here. So just showing you a few, but the entire bone matrix, bone tissue, is invested with blood vessels and nerves and all that stuff. When we look at a bone in the lab, what we're looking at is just the bone matrix. All of the living tissue, the blood vessels, the cells, everything that was part of that as a living organ is gone. And we're just looking at the matrix left over. But in living tissue, all of this is there throughout the whole thing, providing its nutrition and et cetera, et cetera. I keep imagining someday I'm going to make some sort of demonstration item to make this point, but the collagen fibers in the bone matrix, when we consider the lamellae arranged with each other, are oriented at opposing angles. So what this is supposed to suggest is the innermost layer of this osteon has collagen fibers wrapped around it at, say, a 45-degree angle this direction. And then the next layer has collagen fibers wrapped around it at a 45-degree angle in the opposite direction. Now, a good way to demonstrate the purpose of this, which I will someday get around to doing, is to take layers of corrugated cardboard. You know what corrugated cardboard is? You know what cardboard is?
Yeah.
It's corrugated. If you look at it, what cardboard is it's stiff paper, but then it has this, so you have two layers of stiff paper, and then there's more stiff paper that's kind of folded back and forth inside. You see that? If you bend the cardboard, it'll bend very easily along the lines that this inner thing is folding, okay? Get that? If you take two layers of corrugated cardboard, and arrange them at 90 degrees to each other, then you make a very, very strong layer of cardboard. It's very hard to bend it in any direction because there's always some sort of support running in one direction or the other. If you've ever bought IKEA furniture, or, you know, not that IKEA is not cheap furniture too, but cheap knockoffs of IKEA furniture from Walmart or whatever. You know, they have the big cardboard boxes with the slabs that craft check to put together. There are usually little filler spaces that they have thick pieces of cardboard, and what they've probably done is taken a bunch of layers of cardboard and glued them together back and forth so that it's a nice strong block holding the shape of the box that we intended. Anybody seen those before? That's what I'm getting at. So there is collagen in bone matrix, as with most every other connective tissue, but the very organized structure of compact bone, the collagen's arranged so that they're opposing directions that it's twirled around the lamellae, giving the bone a lot of strength, okay? Like you can do by building up layers and layers of cardboard. So, if we zoom in and look at the spongy bone a little bit closer, there's actually lamellae of bone matrix making up the cross-section of a spongy bone trabecula. Trabecula just means sort of bridge or spine. And there's a bunch of space in between these little spiny protrusions of bone. But if we look inside the bone, there's layers of matrix there with osteocytes in between the layers. It's just not as organized as compact bone tissue. Bone originally develops as spongy bone, and then it organizes itself into compact bone structure where it needs that kind of highly organized, strong structure. Now this is a picture of the proximal head of the femur. So this is what fits into your hip bone right here. This is real bone that we're looking at. It's not a drawing. And we can see it's been sawn in half, and we can see the sort of fibrous looking nature of the spongy bone. It's called spongy bone because it looks like we've cut into a loofah sponge or something like that. That's the structure we see. It's not spongy bone because it's soft. It's as hard as compact bone, with the exception of the fact that it can be brittle if you apply force in the wrong direction. If you look at this, and it doesn't really jump out at you in this picture, but the direction that we see the lines of these trabeculae going, for the most part through the spongy bone, is actually lined up with the major stresses that are going to be put on this bone. So the spongy bone in here actually does help provide strength to the bone in the proper orientation. So as you learn to walk and walk throughout the rest of your life, you're putting stresses on the bone in very particular ways. And the spongy bone grows to accommodate the stresses that are necessary. If you were to suddenly start using your femur in a very unusual way, it would probably snap. Okay? Because if you start putting pressure on it in a different way, I can't imagine how that would ever happen in real life. But if you start using your femur in a way that it did not grow and adapt to be doing in your body, it wouldn't be able to withstand the stresses there. Well, I guess an easy way to think of that. People break their hips when they're old because they fall on them and they put stress on the hip in such a way that it doesn't have the bone tissue arranged to deal with those stresses. Happens when people are old because bone tissue also starts to lose some of its solidity as people get older. But really, any broken bone is going to be a matter of you've put stress on a bone in the direction it shouldn't be. Okay? So if you're in a car accident and you break your arm or something like that, or you fall out of a tree as a kid and you break your arm, it's because you've landed on the arm bone in a way that it's not prepared to deal with that stress. So it breaks. Okay? But as far as the way that bones are supposed to be used in your body, they've grown into and adapted to the stresses that they're going to see on a regular basis. And you can kind of see that in the direction that the spongy bone trabeculae run through that picture. And it's not that easy to see on the screen. If you look at a picture like this directly on a computer screen, you'll see the detail a little bit better. And if you get to looking at this before I change out these pictures from the book this weekend, then you can see this picture up close. But all right. Now, the next thing that we want to get into is to talking about the ways that bone grows. Okay. Now, this is sort of a big change in what we've been talking about. What I've done so far is really just talking about the anatomy of bones as organs. And now I want to talk about sort of the physiological aspect of bones, at least in the way that they grow into where they're going to be. I could start talking about this now. I could set up, a couple of terms, but then I just have to start over next Thursday when we meet again for the lecture and say it all again. So why should I do it now if I'm just going to repeat myself next Thursday? So in the last 7 or so minutes that we have, I want to remind you, next week the schedule's a little funny. It is a holiday on Monday. The school will be compensating for that by having Monday classes meet on Tuesday, which means that we will have lab at 10:10 on Monday, and we will not have lecture on, nope, said that wrong. We'll have lab at 10:10 on Tuesday and not have lecture that day. If you have other Tuesday classes, they are also canceled. If your professors from those classes have not told you that, shame on them, but it is true. It's school-wide. That's the way it's going to be. Tuesday is, we're going to pretend is a Monday. If that interferes with your work schedule, if you can't get here until 11 on a Tuesday because of work schedule or something like that, whatever it might be, let me know ahead of time. You get to lab late, you get to lab late. But it's a weird quirk of how we have to adjust the schedule, and please try to be here at 10:10 on Tuesday, but if you can't and you give me some forewarning of that, I'll understand. So now sit on your hands for 6 minutes and then you can leave. No, I'm just kidding. Have a good day.